Picture this. A king standing inside the United States Congress. 12 standing ovations. Democrats and Republicans on their feet, together, for the first time in years. The photographs look like something from a film. The symbolism is almost too perfect. Now picture this. 2 miles away, on the same morning, a group of women who say they were abused by Jeffrey Epstein sitting in congressional offices, demanding answers from the very family whose king is being applauded inside that chamber. And back in England, in a police station in Norfolk, the king's own brother, arrested, questioned for 12 hours, released, but not cleared. This is the British monarchy in 2026. Not the version you see in the palace photographs, the real version, where the greatest triumph and the deepest shame are happening at exactly the same time. Where a 1,000-year-old institution is simultaneously at its most powerful and its most vulnerable. And here's what nobody is talking about. The numbers behind all of it. The data that the palace is quietly terrified of. Because what's happening right now isn't just a scandal. It isn't just a bad headline. It is something much slower and much more dangerous. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what the monarchy is really up against. And whether William and Catherine can save it. To understand how extraordinary that Washington moment was, you first need to understand what led up to it. Because Charles didn't fly to America during a quiet period. He flew there in the middle of the worst royal crisis in living memory. February 19th, 2026. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's 66th birthday. Unmarked police cars arriving at his home on the Sandringham estate before breakfast. No warning, no prior notice to the palace, just officers at the door. And an arrest. Andrew was taken in on suspicion of misconduct in public office, following weeks of explosive new revelations about his relationship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. He spent most of his birthday in a police station answering questions. 12 hours later, he was released, under investigation. Not charged, but not cleared either. And here's why this wasn't just another royal embarrassment. Andrew became the first British royal to be arrested and held in police custody since King Charles I in 1647, who was later put on trial for treason and executed. Royal historians were searching the records for precedent. They had to go back nearly 400 years, but what happened next revealed something even more significant. Something about who is really in charge of this institution right now. Charles didn't route his response through Buckingham Palace. He didn't let his press team absorb the blow. He signed the statement himself, personally, as Charles R., breaking completely from royal protocol. He looked directly at the British public and said, "Let me state clearly, the law must take its course." That wasn't just a statement. That was a declaration. Andrew is not the monarchy continues, and the man running it will not flinch. But what had actually been revealed in those Epstein files? Because that's where this story gets truly shocking. The Epstein files had been dropping for months. Each release was worse than the last, but it wasn't a steady drip. It was a series of detonations, and each one landed on a palace that had no way to absorb it. December 2025. The US Department of Justice released the first major batch, photos showing Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell hunting with Andrew at Balmoral, Andrew in the royal box at Ascot with Epstein beside him. Images that placed the convicted sex offender inside the most private spaces the royal family possesses. Not a hotel lobby, not a public event. Balmoral, the family's most sacred private retreat. The palace said nothing. They almost always say nothing. And for a moment it looked like the strategy might hold. Then January 2026 arrived, and the second batch was worse. Documents including photographs appearing to show Andrew on all fours over a fully clothed woman lying on the floor. Images of him touching her stomach. Email exchanges where Epstein proposed introducing Andrew to a 26-year-old Russian woman, describing her as clever, beautiful, trustworthy. Andrew's reply? That he would be delighted to see her. Delighted to see her. In writing. In an email. To Jeffrey Epstein. The palace still said nothing. But something had shifted, because these weren't just photographs at a polo match or a dinner. These were documents, emails, a paper trail of a relationship that Andrew had spent years insisting was merely a friendship he'd later regretted. And here is the detail that changed everything. The investigation wasn't just about what Andrew did with Epstein socially. It was about what he did with Epstein professionally. Some of the files suggested that Andrew had forwarded to Epstein reports about Vietnam, Singapore, and other places he had visited on official trips as UK trade envoy. In one confidential memo, he saw Epstein's views on investment opportunities in Afghanistan's Helmand province. Read that again. The King's brother, a senior British trade representative, asking a convicted sex offender for investment advice on Afghanistan, using classified government access, forwarding official diplomatic reports. That is not a social embarrassment. That is a potential criminal act. And that is what the arrest on February 19th was actually about. But what nobody was reporting, what was buried under the Andrew headlines, was who else the files were touching. And that answer led somewhere nobody expected. April 28th, 2026, the Chamber of the United States Congress. Charles delivered what would become his best and most consequential speech as king, earning 12 bipartisan standing ovations. 12. In an era when American politicians won't applaud anything the other side might also applaud, a British king had both chambers on their feet. Repeatedly. But this wasn't just a ceremony. Underneath the warmth and the perfectly timed humour, Charles was doing something remarkable. Something almost audacious. He implicitly challenged America's current political direction. He defended Western democracy, checks and balances, alliances, the rule of law, an independent judiciary. He invoked the Magna Carta. He told the room that America's words carry weight and meaning. The actions of this great nation matter even more. He defended NATO, the organization Trump has repeatedly attacked. He warned against isolationism. He emphasized limits on executive power, all without once mentioning Trump by name, all without once breaking the constitutional convention that a monarch must remain above politics. Think about what that actually was. A descendant of King George III, the monarch the American Revolution was fought against, delivering a masterclass in democratic accountability to the direct descendants of that revolution, and being cheered for it. But then came the moment that exposed the impossible tightrope Charles is walking. At the state dinner that same evening, Trump told the assembled guests, "Charles agrees with me even more than I do. We're never going to let that opponent have a nuclear weapon," appearing to reveal what he claimed was a private conversation with the king about Iran, a constitutional monarch, bound by convention to stay above politics, suddenly appearing to have a public position on one of the most explosive geopolitical flashpoints on the planet. The palace said nothing. They never do, but the damage was done. A private conversation turned into a political headline, and Charles couldn't say a word in response. Triumph and chaos at the same time. It was the theme of the entire visit. Here's the part of the Washington story that didn't make the front pages. While Charles was receiving those standing ovations inside the Capitol, 2 miles away on Capitol Hill, Epstein survivors were meeting with members of Congress. Family members of Virginia Giuffre, who had accused Andrew of sexual assault and who died by suicide the previous year, were among those present. They were there because US lawmakers had written to Charles directly, requesting a meeting with survivors during his visit, requesting that the king look these women in the eye. Buckingham Palace confirmed the king and queen would not be accepting that request. The reason given, it could affect the ongoing criminal investigation into Andrew. Legally, that's the correct call. No one seriously disputes it, but humanly, the image of it is devastating. A king being applauded inside the most powerful legislative building in the world. Survivors waiting 2 miles away. The meeting that never came. What you've just heard. The survivors 2 miles from the Capitol. The meeting that never came. A king preaching reconciliation while his son sat uninvited. That's the story of 1 week. But the story underneath it, the one that was already building before Andrew was arrested, before the state visit was announced, before any of this became a headline. That story is bigger, and the numbers tell it better than any scandal can. Make sure you're subscribed before we get into them, because what comes next reframes everything. And we've got a lot more of this coming. One US congressman didn't hold back. "It's easy to talk about democratic values in the abstract," he said, "when you're not being introspective about your own family's role in the power dynamics and the abuse that took place. The palace had no response to that, because there is no good response to that. And what happened next reveals exactly how precarious the monarchy's position really is, because the damage isn't just reputational, it's generational. And the numbers prove it. Here is the number the palace does not want to talk about. Not the arrest, not the Epstein files, not the survivor protests outside the Capitol. One number, sitting quietly in a YouGov dataset, more dangerous to the long-term future of the monarchy than anything Andrew has done. In 1983, 86% of Britons said it was very important, or quite important, to continue having a monarchy. Last year, that figure had fallen to 51%, 86 to 51, in 4 decades. Not a crisis, not a collapse. Something slower and more permanent than either of those things. An erosion. The kind that doesn't make headlines in any given year and is almost impossible to reverse once it reaches a certain depth. And Andrew accelerated it. Fast. Ipsos polling conducted in February 2026, before the arrest had even happened, found that only 37% of Britons believed abolishing the monarchy would be worse for the country. In November 2025, that figure was 47%, 10 points, in 3 months, driven entirely by the Epstein files before a single arrest had been made. But here is the number that should keep William awake at night. The one that doesn't show up in the headline polling because it requires breaking the data down by age. Among Britons aged 16 to 34, almost 6 in 10 favour an elected head of state over the monarchy. 6 in 10 of the generation that will be running this country in 20 years. More people in that age group want to abolish the monarchy than want to keep it. And that preference doesn't tend to reverse as people get older. It tends to harden. The monarchy isn't losing the country. It is losing the future of the country. And no state visit, however triumphant, however many standing ovations, however many photographs on the White House lawn, changes that underlying arithmetic. There is one thing standing between those numbers and complete freefall. William and Catherine, around 3/4 of Britons view them favourably. They are what the institution is betting everything on. And that bet might be right. But right now, with Andrew under investigation, the files still dropping, and a generation that has quietly decided the monarchy is irrelevant to their lives, it is still a bet, and the odds are shifting in ways that no press office can spin and no state visit can reverse. Which is why what happened 2 miles from the Capitol, while the standing ovations were still echoing, matters more than any photograph from that week. So here is where we actually are. Charles III just pulled off one of the most diplomatically impressive performances by a British monarch in a generation. He stood in front of a divided American Congress and got both sides cheering. He navigated the Epstein shadow, the Iran tensions, the Andrew fallout, and came out of Washington with the monarchy's global standing arguably enhanced. And at the same time, his brother is under criminal investigation. The Epstein files are still being released. The monarchy's support among young Britons is at a historic low, and the survivors of the man Andrew called his friend were sitting 2 miles from those standing ovations, waiting for a meeting that the palace had already decided would never happen. This is not a story with a clean ending. The monarchy has survived worse. Edward VIII's abdication, the annus horribilis of 1992, Diana's death, the years of public fury that followed. It has 1,000 years of muscle memory for outlasting whatever is trying to destroy it. Even now, 64% of Britons still believe the UK should continue to be a kingdom. The institution is not collapsing, but it is at an inflection point. And inflection points are more dangerous than crises, because they don't announce themselves. They just quietly, gradually, permanently shift the ground beneath you. The monarchy's survival now depends on one thing above everything else. Not Charles's diplomatic skill, not the state visits, or the standing ovations, or the white tie dinners. It depends on whether William and Catherine can do what no other royal generation has managed: make the institution feel genuinely necessary to people who have never needed to think about it before, Because that's the real question of 2026. Not whether the monarchy survives Andrew, it will. The question is whether it survives being irrelevant to an entire generation. And right now, nobody has a convincing answer. The best week. The worst year. At exactly the same time. That is the House of Windsor in 2026.